Hello and welcome back to Tongue-Tied Tales. I'm Richard. Here in episode 2 we get deep into a scandal-filled Japanese story of the company Nozu, its founder Chairman Nozu and me. It's a story of a visionary who was corrupted by power, ending with one of the biggest business disasters since World War II, a tale of a pink rabbit, the Japanese mafia and a secret love hotel-style complex. It's also my own story of my time in Japan. Last episode ended in September 2003 when I left England for Japan to work for the country's largest English academy called Nozu. I had already had to lie to one of my grandmothers about going to Japan. My grandmother, who was in her 90s by then, reacted very badly when I told her I was planning to teach in Japan. She said that all Japanese were treacherous, and there was no reasoning with her. Her generation suffered so much in World War II, and she remembered hearing about the cruelty of Japanese soldiers from her friends. I tried to tell her that the world had changed, but in the end I had to change, and lied, telling her I was going to France to teach English instead. In reality, I was about to fly to Tokyo to work for Nozu. I landed in Tokyo's Narita airport one morning in September 2003 with no idea about where I would be teaching or what my company was like. I had done zero research. I was 21 years old. Once through customs, I and other fresh teaching recruits were welcomed by a young Nozu representative and told where we needed to go. I was instructed to take a train to Tsuyama, which turned out to be a small town in the west of Japan in the Okayama prefecture, about 5 hours by train from Tokyo. Most of the other teachers all seemed to be either staying in Tokyo or going to other big cities like Osaka to work. I remembered then that I had asked to be placed somewhere in the countryside. My first impressions of Japan were of my bullet train speeding across the country with bowing ticket collectors passing through the carriages, and also of how few Japanese people seemed to speak English. When I finally got off the train at Tsuyama Station, I was met by my new teacher colleagues from Nozu. There were two young American guys called Mac and Zach, two Aussies, Sheila and Stuart, and Alma, a lady from the Philippines. We were all in our early to mid-20s. I soon discovered that both Zach and Stuart were dating Japanese girls who worked in the nearby Mr. Donut shop. Zach would eventually marry and have 4 kids with that Mr. Donuts girl. For now we had just met, and the Aussie guy, Stuart, who was like my new boss and head teacher at the small academy, took the lead. "G'day mate, let's get you settled in." Stuart first took me to the company apartment I would be living in. It was a recently built 2-bedroom place on the ground floor, and I would be the only one living there. I was also given a simple, no-nonsense bicycle to get to work on. My apartment was surrounded by rice paddies, small fields growing rice, and other apartment buildings, and I could see a forest in the distance. There was a small river called the Kamo River to the south, and I would soon be riding my bicycle every day along that river before crossing it to get to the nearby shopping mall where I would work. And with my bags now stowed in the new apartment, this was exactly where Stuart took me. "Let's go to the Nozu Academy in the mall, mate." Once inside the average-sized mall, we went up the escalator and walked through rows of clothes on sale, and I saw a place selling super high-tech mobile phones, well, at least compared to Europe back then in 2003. And there, tucked into the corner of the first floor of the mall, was the Nozu English Academy. There was a rectangular, electrified dark blue plastic sign at the entrance with Nozu written on it in bright yellow letters. There was also a big and weird looking pink rabbit thing near the reception area. Beyond that, I could see 4 or 5 small classrooms with transparent windows. Inside each classroom were curved horseshoe-shaped wooden tables, with a seat for the teacher on the inside and chairs for up to 4 students on the outside. Right now, I could see Mac, Sheila and Alma, teachers I had met earlier at the train station, and they were teaching Japanese students. Mac, who was tall and overweight, was leaning over a Japanese schoolgirl while almost shouting, "What colour is the train?" while Sheila was laughing and chatting with 3 young businessmen in another classroom. I was then introduced to the Japanese branch manager, a lady called Saito, and a tired but pretty young receptionist at the front desk. I was also pretty tired after a long day travelling from England. I was happy when Stuart finally left me to sit in the reception area of this tiny Nova Academy. "Be back in a minute, mate." I say tiny because I would later see that Nova Academies in the bigger towns and cities could easily have 30 plus teachers working at just one branch. We were only 6 crammed into the corner of this mall. As I sat on a pink sofa with some waiting Japanese students who all shyly said hello and bowed a little, I began to get impressed by how professional Saito and the receptionist were at the front desk. Everyone who came in was warmly welcomed with a Japanese phrase, "Yoshamasen, dozo!" And I would see later that they were never late or grumpy like us Westerners could be. They always left their personal issues well at home. This reflected the Japanese concepts of honne and tatamae. Tatamae is your public facade or people-pleasing face, while your honne represents your true inner feelings, which are hidden from public view. I guess it's the same all over the world, but in Japan the difference seemed more exaggerated. I was happily soaking up the atmosphere at my new workplace when suddenly a tall blonde man with glasses appeared in front of me with his hand outstretched. I could see the people around us freeze, and Saito at the front desk suddenly looked quite angry. I shook his hand, and in a strong Tasmanian accent he told me his name was Dagger and that he was the teacher I was replacing. And of all the things that I remember that first ever day in Japan, I remember meeting this man called Dagger, the Tasmanian snake sake making ex-Australian park ranger and Mensa member who had just been sacked by Nova. I immediately liked Dagger, who seemed very genuine as he welcomed me to Japan and Nova, even if he was a bit bitter about losing his job there. He'd been working at Nova for 4 years, and I soon discovered that Dagger was a very popular man around Tsuyama, regularly hosting barbecues at his place with many of the students and teachers from Nova present. And that was why he really lost his job, for socializing with students outside of work. This was the first, but far from the last thing I heard of Nova's notorious no fraternization policy, or as many teachers called it, the no sex rule. This was a rule that prohibited teachers from socializing in any way with students outside of a workplace. This was very hard to do, I would find, in quite a small rural town like Tsuyama. This policy also encouraged some power-hungry and rather small-minded teachers, maybe after promotion or just jealous of a more popular teacher, to inform on them to try and get them sacked by the company. It was a lot to take in on my first day in Japan, and Stuart soon got me away from Dagger and took me back to my apartment, where, tired but happy, I spent my first night in Japan sleeping soundly on a futon close to the floor, listening to the crickets from the river and rice paddies surrounding me. Over the next few weeks I would find my feet. Although my grandmother, who I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, suddenly passed away during that first month in Japan. She had been no ordinary grandmother, as she had raised me as my second parent. As I didn't have a mobile phone at the time, I discovered this news on a rainy October day as I cycled around Tsuyama exploring on my day off. I remember I went to an internet cafe to find an email, an old email, telling me the news that my grandmother had died in my junk mail. I dumbly cycled to the Nova Academy and started crying at the reception. Saito, who barely knew me then, seemed to think I was on drugs perhaps and was embarrassing the students, and so she got Stuart to take me into the back office, where he comforted me and helped me call home. As I wasn't able to attend the funeral, I found it really difficult. That night I cycled down a road near my apartment. It was dark and I just wanted to get lost in the night. After some hours riding, I felt very cold and hungry and stopped at the next place I saw to eat. It turned out to be a Japanese okonomiyaki place, which specialise in delicious savoury pancakes with meat, seafood and cabbage concoctions among the many to be found. I sat at the bar and ordered a drink. There was a bald Japanese man next to me, with a funny goatee beard. We said hello. It was obvious he didn't speak English and I didn't speak Japanese, but somehow we understood one another. He said he was called Shiga-chan, and I soon gave up trying to explain my full name, which he struggled with, and said I was called Ichi-chan. Shiga-chan told me he was a carpenter and karate sensei through gesture, and that he lived nearby with his wife and 2 children. I told him I wanted to go to karate. He said he would take me the next day and ordered us more okonomiyaki. Meeting Shiga-chan that day changed my life forever. I started taking 2-hour-long karate lessons 3 times a week for the next 6 months, cycling up and down a couple of miles of hills to get to each class. After the classes, I would then spend the evenings with his family, his wife Setsuko and his daughter Akane of 14 and his son Yoshi of 12. We would often sit for hours using paper Japanese-English dictionaries to communicate. Yoshi often wanted to know what the latest English pop songs meant, while Setsuko would be angry when Shiga-chan spent too much money and time at Japanese pachinko places, which are like gambling-style casinos which use silver balls. This family adopted me and looked after me as a young man, and over 20 years later our families are still close. So now, with my own story in Japan somewhat established, we will zoom out a little more to focus on the tale of the rise of the Nova Company and the life of its founder, Chairman Nozu. Right from the beginning of my time in Japan, it was clear that the English Academy Nova was popular. For starters, its mascot Novorusagi, a pink anime toy rabbit with a yellow bird's beak for a nose, was everywhere you looked, along with David Beckham at that time, who was selling everything from yogurt to spark plugs. I confess that one night in Tsuyama I crept out and stole a huge David Beckham poster to give to my American colleague Zach as a wedding present. It showed a giant Beckham holding a huge spark plug and was graciously received by my friend and his Japanese bride during my wedding speech. But Novorusagi was even bigger than Beckham. The cartoon bunny was on giant billboards and TV adverts with celebrities. Back then, with branches in most shopping malls and near busy subway stations in every major town and city, Nova was the #1 ikaiwa or conversation school. And the annual employee conferences were attended with a near religious zeal by the Japanese employees in particular. There were around 700 branches when I first started for Nova in 2003, and they were expanding fast. Nova was called the McDonald's of the English teaching world for good reason back then, and we, their underqualified young teachers, were the burger flippers. Only a select few of us had actual teaching qualifications, but Nova was clever. They got us all to dress up in business attire, and then they made sure to have the most attractive teachers give demo lessons to potential students. The sales staff at the academy would often try and sell lessons by saying stuff like, "Hey, we've got a sexy new American teacher coming in. Would you like a pack of 300 lessons?" So, despite some controversial sales tactics and the no fraternization rule, Nova was going strong in 2003. It had a cool image and popular mascot, and a lot of dynamic, if sometimes hungover, young teachers. It also didn't hurt that the teaching method, while not the greatest, compared extremely favourably with what was offered in most Japanese schools, where students still came out unable to speak English. So it seemed I had largely landed on my feet by choosing to work for Nozu in Japan. And when I decided to quit after 7 months in the job in order to pursue a clowning course in Spain, as you should at the age of 22 by the way, I was especially criticised by the Japanese staff at the academy, who thought I was giving up a wonderful career opportunity with a great company and visionary founder. But 3 years later, I was teaching in Rome in Italy when I saw some shocking news about Nozu. As in 2007, Nozu suddenly filed for bankruptcy, closing the doors on its close to 1,000 academies by that time. In the build-up to the event, thousands of Nozu teachers and staff were left unpaid and teaching for food even for months, and lawsuits from angry students demanding refunds began to pile up. Western embassies and airlines from the US, UK and Canada had to step in to provide assistance to stranded and penniless teachers. Sure, a few teachers had likely drunk or partied away their savings, but this was besides the point. It became hugely embarrassing for Japan that the largest employer of foreign nationals treated its staff like this, and criminal investigations began. Among other things, these investigations revealed the embezzlement of hundreds of millions of yen of company funds, and even a secretly built love hotel-style complex at the company's headquarters in Osaka. Fingers were pointing, and most of the fingers pointed to Chairman Nozu, the autocratic company founder. And the police were not the only ones looking for Chairman Nozu. Japan's most powerful Yakuza, a mafia-style crime group called the Yamaguchi Gumi, were also chasing down Chairman Nozu. But what exactly caused Japan's most successful language school to fall apart like this? Before we get any further into the details of Nozu's final days and its founder's fall, it's time to go back in time to the beginning of founder Chairman Nozu's life, as we trace Nozu and his company's meteoric rise to power, and how he planted the seeds of his and his own company's destruction. Nozu came from humble origins and was born to school-teacher parents in the Osaka prefecture of Japan in 1951. He was raised in the city of Kishiwada, which is famous for its high-energy Danjiri Kishiwada festivals, a highlight of which are decorated wooden floats being pulled around the streets at high speeds. Nozu came of age in this district of Osaka while Japan rebounded spectacularly from near destruction in the Second World War to see incredible economic growth, which lasted until the early 90s when the Japanese bubble burst. Upon finishing high school, Nozu wanted to travel and chose not to stay in his home country, and made the first of several curious and life-changing decisions. Nozu chose to study physics in Paris, France. He spoke little to no French, and his English was nowhere near the level required to study academically at this time. Maybe somehow Nozu thought he wouldn't really need to speak French to study physics in France, or maybe that he could quickly pick up the language. Nozu was wrong. Because of this decision, what was supposed to be a 2-year physics course in Paris took Nozu at least 5 years to maybe complete, as whether he finished his physics course or not in Paris seems a closely guarded internet secret. Still, these years were hugely formative ones for Nozu, the future king of an English teaching empire. Looking back at his time in France, Nozu said he felt very frustrated that he couldn't make friends easily due to his poor foreign language abilities. And so, after one of several failed physics courses and exams in Paris, Nozu decided enough was enough, and he left France for Denmark to study French and English for about a year. It was the 1970s, and Denmark's education system had just undergone huge modernising reforms, where basically all the old stuffy university professors suddenly lost their powers and were replaced by democratically elected boards and councils composed of young students and other forward-thinking faculty staff. Here, Nozu made young, free-thinking and dynamic European friends, and also met many language teachers. He experienced being taught languages in a way completely different from how Japanese schools taught them. Language teaching in Denmark was innovative and included elements of the then upstart communicative language teaching model, where students are encouraged to interact freely with one another and the teacher in lessons. Nozu would have been dumbstruck. He would also have seen a direct method of language teaching in action, where translation and grammar explanations are frowned upon, and students have to figure out language rules for themselves, as quote-unquote real examples of language in context are given until things start to click naturally. It was a transformational experience for young Nozu, who had gone through Japan's capable but pretty old-fashioned education system based on the transmission model or rote learning. This transmission learning model is the one in which students memorize large amounts of information for exams. In English lessons, grammar would be written on the board and then analysed with a lot of emphasis on repetition and little analysis or critical thinking. One advantage of this was that what you learned at school would often stay with you for life. It was drummed in. But the disadvantages are obvious, whether in terms of not encouraging creativity and being basically boring. This was compounded in Japan by something worse, not always teaching exactly what students needed for their final exams in school lessons. I saw the negative effects of this myself when I spent time with Shika-chan's family and others. His young kids, Akane and Yoshi, would stay up very late at night cramming for exams and would often have to attend extra classes out of school. And when I asked why the teenagers were doing this, they told me it was because the school lessons didn't cover the exam material. Did Nozu imagine that one day he would offer a solution to this problem in Japan's rigid education system? The young Nozu couldn't have known that he would go back to Japan to shake things up by hiring thousands of young and fairly attractive foreign teachers to make English learning look cool again. I find this messy period of Nozu's life pretty fascinating, that a young, curious, adventurous and evidently fairly well-funded Japanese man spent much of the 1970s on a European adventure. It was so unlike most other Japanese men who would have started working as loyal company men immediately after school and stayed with that company most of their lives. But it shows his risk-taking nature and tells us how he prepared without realizing for building an educational empire. But sadly, beyond the broad brushstrokes, there isn't so much information about this fascinating period of Nozu's life. And so, I was inspired to write a short fictional story based on Nozu and an imaginary Danish friend of his called Dansk in Paris. So, please bear with me for a brief fictional diversion, which I do hope can inform our understanding of the real Nozu's character and later actions in some small way. For the second time in as many months, Nozu found himself standing, gazing across a cobbled street at the elegant neo-Renaissance windows of the Sorbonne University in Paris. It was a rainy morning, and inside, beyond those windows, Nozu knew his peers were engrossed in a physics exam, a test he himself should be taking right now. A soft sigh escaped Nozu's lips, lost amid the pitter-patter of the raindrops. His gloved fingers fumbled to retrieve a cigarette from his pack, the familiar routine providing a brief respite from his thoughts. As the rain ebbed into a gentle drizzle, Nozu put the cigarette in his mouth and took a slow drag while walking across the street to stand directly in front of one of the long windows. Leaning forward, he pressed his forehead against the cool glass, his breath fogging the pane as he peered into the hallowed halls. He saw his course mates sat hunched over their papers. Amidst them, a pair of eyes lifted from the exam, catching Nozu's tall, slim silhouette in their peripheral vision. A mischievous grin tugged at the corner of one student's lips, and he momentarily abandoned his paper. playfully contorting his face at Nozu into a comical expression before returning to the exam. Outside, Nozu's face was an enigmatic mask, revealing nothing of the emotions swirling within him. His mind was full of frustration and regretful thoughts. Why did I choose to study physics here? This subject seemed more elusive than the raindrops falling from his fingers, and after 4 years at the university spending his parents' savings, he still hadn't managed to pass one single physics exam. Time passed, and with another heavy sigh, Nozu tore his gaze away from the scene and turned on his heel, striding towards a nearby coffee shop where his bicycle awaited. Leaning against the wall like an old friend, he tossed a coin to the waiter in a gesture of gratitude for his vigilant watch. From here, Nozu pedalled northeast, crossing the river Seine with the grace of an experienced cyclist. One of his preferred destinations, the Café Charlotte, lay ahead. Nestled near Rue de l'Aigre, a busy street market, the café was a safe haven amid the busy streets of Paris. Upon arriving, Nozu carefully parked his bicycle again outside, commanding a waiter he recognized to "Keep an eye on it, Louis." Nozu was here for a rendezvous with Dansk, a fellow academic failure from Denmark, who like Nozu had lost his way with his degree course. Before going to find his friend, Nozu quickly headed for the toilet, before bolting the door behind him and taking off his backpack. Opening it up carefully, he took out some neatly folded clothing. It was a replica of the latest French national team football kit, with a matching deep blue tracksuit. The Adidas logo was present on the right breast, and red, white and blue tricolour stripes ran down the arms. With the 1978 World Cup in Argentina fast approaching, Nozu had another money-making plan. Checking his appearance in the mirror, Nozu then packed his wet clothes into the bag and headed inside the cafe again, where an aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Patrons of varying ages occupied the intimate tables, their conversations blending into a harmonious hum. Nozu's gaze swept across the crowd, seeking the familiar shock of long red hair that belonged to his friend Dansk. As his eyes locked onto that unmistakable mane of hair, almost hidden behind a newspaper Dansk was reading, Nozu's heart lightened, before he quickly weaved his way through the tables to where his friend sat. Dansk rose happily to shake hands.
"Nozu, what brings you here? Don't you—"
"Don't say the word exam. It's not a topic worthy of our time."
"Agreed," said Dansk, before smiling. "So, what grand plans shall we discuss today?"
The conversation flowed easily between the two friends, who had grown close learning French together in Denmark, and the topic eventually veered towards the tracksuit Nozu wore.
"Garish,"
said Dansk, looking his friend up and down. "Glorious, you mean," Nozu returned, before he stood up and turned around slowly, which allowed Dansk to see the misspelt brand name of Adidas, which had a double S at the end instead of a single one.
"Unfortunately, my friend, your tracksuit remains forgettable,"
said Dansk, laughing before his face turned serious, and he asked Nozu,
"You think we can sell it?"
Nozu turned to look his friend in the eye. "That's what we do best."
"What did you get them for?"
asked Dansk. 25 francs each, replied Nozu. "These tracksuits, my friend, are destined for the stalls of Rue de l'Aigre market. I have 500 of them, and will sell them for a 200% markup, I promise you." A memory then stirred within Dansk's mind as his words cut through Nozu's optimism.
Remember the bangers, Nozu? Yes, those firecrackers we sold last month? Most turned out to be duds, and then we had angry buyers chasing us off the stall by the end."
"Ah, that venture simply fine-tuned our expertise, Dansk," Nozu laughed. "Think about it. There's the World Cup next month, and the lads around here are crazy for it." Soon enough, market day came around, and extra S or not, it turned out that Nozu's instincts were right on the money again. There would surely be another big party tonight at Nozu's place, and Dansk was looking forward to it. We now return to reality, as Nozu, after roughly 5 years in Europe, decided that the time had come to journey back to the land of his beginnings, to his home city of Osaka and Japan, probably without a physics degree. And it is here that we will leave our tale for now. In the next episode, we will see the young Nozu start his company Nova with backpacker friends, as the reign of Usagi and the superhero Charisma Man begins.